Welcome to Torchlight's Exceptional Parenting Podcast, where we talk with the nation's top experts about today's toughest parenting challenges. Whether you're concerned about your child's development, learning, behavior, or you just want to make family time more enjoyable, we share the practical solutions and tools that can help.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to an all-new episode of the Exceptional Parenting Podcast, brought to you by Torchlight. I'm your host, Stefanie Boucher, and if you are the parent or caregiver of a child who is a picky eater, or if mealtime in your house feels unpleasant, shall we say, on a regular basis, then this is the episode for you. It probably goes without saying that eating challenges in children are very common. In fact, about 1 in 3 parents identifies his or her child as being a quote-unquote picky eater, according to today's guest. Of course, feeding challenges are a spectrum of sorts. There's a lot of variation between individual kids. One parent, for example, may simply be concerned about a cautious child whose diet is a bit limited because maybe they're fearful of trying new things, or they really like eating from 1 or 2 particular food groups, but not others. Some children just have a few select foods that they will eat and are pretty averse to most foods, and some can't take in enough nourishment to support growth or overall health. It's a really complicated topic for sure, but we are going to try and break some of it down for you today and offer some positive solutions that may help you and your family begin to move forward if this is a challenging area for you. I am here today with Dr. Katjia Rowell. She is a family doctor and childhood feeding specialist who has helped numerous families, as well as a popular speaker and writer. She is the co-author of Helping Your Child with Extreme Picky Eating and Love Me, Feed Me, the Adoptive Parent's Guide to Ending the Worry About Weight, Picky Eating, Power Struggles, and more. Welcome, Dr. Rowell. I am super excited to have you on the show.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here. We also have a book that came out last year, I think since you first contacted me, called Conquer Picky Eating for Teens and Adults. So we've now expanded that to address the teens who didn't necessarily get help when they were younger.
You know, I've wanted to cover this topic for such a long time now. As you know very well, this is such a loaded topic for so many families, parents and children, really. Challenges around food or feeding or meal times can cause so much angst for people. And, it's really such a basic primal desire as a parent to be able to nourish your child. And most of us never imagine when we go into parenting that this seemingly simple activity of daily living could become so hard. I think one of the things that strikes the fear chord in so many parents beyond the obvious struggles around it all is this sharp concern that their child won't be getting what, she needs to thrive and grow. And it's hard to know in certain cases when to worry. So maybe we'll just start there. How does one differentiate typical eating from picky eating? And how is picky eating different from extreme picky eating? The way you define it in your book. When does picky eating become a bigger concern?
Sure. I just want to also note that I came to this feeding work as a worried parent myself. And so I have a lot of empathy with parents. And I, had that kiddo where I had feeding and growth worries and I didn't know what to do. And it's something I wanted to bring up right from the start is I was, a trained family doctor who went to, a top 10 medical school and a great residency program. And we did not get trained in this. And this is kind of the unfortunate thing. And you're absolutely right. 1 in 3 parents will ask their doctor for help with feeding and growth concerns. And a lot of times the doctors just aren't trained in how to help. And so I just want to encourage parents, if you feel like you're getting advice from your child's doctor that is not working, it's backfiring, things aren't going well, to find more resources. And unfortunately, it's a real problem that sometimes the first people parents go to aren't necessarily offering, the best advice. So how do we tell extreme picky eating from picky eating? So about a third to half of kids are picky eaters, according to their parents. And so often, and another thing, if you're reading an article on picky eaters, don't read the comments, because it's like this horrible shaming, blaming, oh, my kids aren't picky and we weren't picky. We just ate what we were told. And there's this impression that it's spoiled American parents and their picky kids. But, the study came out in Denmark a couple years ago that it's pretty much the same over there. So we know that it's very normal, and it's actually, we think, an evolutionary phase. That typical picky eating was actually kind of protective. When toddlers start to go away from parents and they're exploring the world through their mouths, it's a good thing that they're afraid and not picking up everything on the ground and sticking it in their mouths. So it's very typical for that older infant that's been eating all of those, with baby food jars or the homemade organic, baby foods. They've been eating a wide variety, and then suddenly they get to that sort of 12, 15, 18 months. And then they start, tossing the foods on the floor, and then things they ate, they don't reliably eat anymore. So it's very typical for children to go through that phase of being a little bit cautious around new foods. Whereas when they were 10 months old, they may have stuck everything into their mouths and, been open to trying new foods. So typical picky eaters tends to kind of come around 12, 15 months, where we start to see them beginning to reject foods. And we also know that developmentally, these early toddlers and into 2, their job is to explore the environment and to learn and to separate from their parents. And so they're going to do everything they can to get the food that they want. So they're going to toss their second or fifth favorite food, because so often with that worry, if they reject the first 3, the parents will end up, out of that fear, they have to eat something, so I'll give them that mac and cheese. And so knowing what's typical, that it's typical for them to reject foods, and knowing that we have to keep offering foods over and over and over again can protect us from typical picky eating turning into that more persistent picky eating. For example, my daughter, one of her first foods was banana. It was like her third word was nana. She ate them like gangbusters and then completely did not eat them for probably 6 months or more. But we kept them coming back, and then eventually she found her way back to them again. But the problem is with that typical picky eating phase, if parents don't know and they think, oh, now she doesn't like bananas, and then they just stop showing up. And so it's just a really critical thing that it's normal for them to reject foods they used to like. They should be adding some new foods here and there. But the super critical information with that piece is to keep them showing up over and over and over again. And at some point down the road, they're likely to just start eating it if we're, having those non-pressured exposures during meal times. So that's kind of a typical picky eating phase. Typical picky eaters tend to eat from all the food groups. Not at every meal, but throughout the day, they might have some fruit with that afternoon snack, or they might have a vegetable at lunchtime. They might have some meat if you're feeding that to your child, some grains. So they're eating from the different food groups. It's also really important to know that typical eaters in that very young phase don't eat from every food group. It's not going to look like that My Plate chart that you'll see online. It's not half fruits and vegetables. It might be spaghetti at one meal, and then the next snack, it's 2 clementines. And then the next opportunity to eat, they're not very hungry, so they might just have 1 blueberry and a bite of graham cracker. And then the next meal, it's yogurt. So that throughout the day, or if you look over 2 or 3 days, you see that their nutrients are actually fairly balanced. So that's another really important misperception, is that like every meal has to be balanced.
Right.
So it doesn't. So normal, typical eating is kind of here and there from the different food groups, but they do tend to eat from all the different food groups. Now, they're going to get upset if they don't get a favorite, but it's an age-appropriate upset. So my 4-year-old daughter coming and finding out that I had made brown rice with her favorite little turkey curry dish, she pitched an appropriate upset and, I like white rice. And I said, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry you're upset. We're having brown rice today. We'll have white rice again soon. And then we sat down to the table and she was able to eat some curry. She calmed herself down. That's kind of a typical thing where they're going to try to get their favorite and they're going to be upset. Not typical would be a 90-minute meltdown, and they're not able to calm themselves and they're not able to eat other things from the meal. A not typical reaction is something that looks really fear-based or panicky. Some kids with more extreme picky eating, when they're presented with foods that are challenging for them or that they've had bad experiences with, it almost looks like a panic reaction. You'll see, their breathing speeds up, they're visibly upset. So you see that fear, that anxiety aspect more with the persistent presentation. So those are just some general differences. And the other thing with extreme picky eating is that we tend to see that they have struggled often even younger than a year and a half. So more commonly, you'll have the history where parents say, we've struggled with eating since day one, or like breastfeeding was a nightmare. We did make bottle feeding work, but we had a terrible time transitioning to purees. Or my 2-year-old only eats purees. We've never had more complicated textures, or they have never had a fruit or vegetable. So they're not eating from all of the food groups, and we might see that it's not a balanced thing even over 3 or 4 days. So those are some of the differences in terms of a typical versus a more extreme presentation.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I love the fact that you pointed out that kind of evolutionary. I had never thought about that before. It makes so much sense, though. It really does. And I've also never thought about the fact that it's what they're eating over several days' time and not necessarily in every meal. That is really interesting information.
That's a huge tip.
Absolutely. But for parents, though, who really do have extreme picky eaters, is there hope for their child down the line? I mean, I think some people are just so afraid that their child is only going to eat 3 foods for the rest of their life. Yes. In your experience, do they, even the pickiest of eaters, do they tend to grow out of it? Or
absolutely. Okay. Yes, there absolutely is hope. It's a complicated topic. And when we think about extreme picky eating, and, a lot of people don't like the word picky because it kind of sounds like, oh, they're just being picky. But we could use the word selective or avoidant or anxious or fussy, or some people use finicky, but that reminds me of cat food commercials, from my childhood. But so whatever word parents feel comfortable using, extreme or persistent selective avoidant eating is when the amount or the variety that they eat is so limited that it impacts their social development. So maybe they can't go to sleepovers or they can't go to birthday parties. And, they're beginning to be socially isolated because of their eating or the anxiety or the reaction around eating. Or we might see nutritional or growth issues that can come out of extreme selective or avoidant eating. And I have absolutely worked with kiddos who, the majority of the kids I've worked with, because I'm not in the typical referral system, have quote unquote failed, pediatric feeding therapy. Most of them have been like, gosh, we've been doing this sensory-based feeding therapy for a year and a half and it's not working. And now we only have 5 foods or we have 8 foods. Or we went to this behavioral program and that just made it worse. And I had to put him in a headlock to eat or, whatever the history is. So even with these presentations where it's been for years, I see these kiddos so often going on to be able to enjoy a wide variety of foods and to be able to, learn to be a more competent eater where they're eating enough variety and they're able to decrease the anxiety and the social isolation. So absolutely. And there are other providers too. There's a great group on the East Coast called Thrive by Spectrum Pediatrics. And they have this incredible tube weaning program where even kiddos who've never really eaten by mouth and who've been tube fed for years and they've had really scary medical experiences or feeding experiences, they can absolutely learn to find joy and variety at mealtime. So I definitely want parents to have a sense that there's hope.
That is excellent news. I think another thing that happens for families is, we touched on it just briefly a second ago, parents encountering disapproval from friends and relatives who maybe haven't raised children who were picky eaters themselves. And I know for some friends that I've had, people can end up constantly questioning themselves whether or not they've played a role in their child's eating behaviors or if it's their fault. What are the causes of picky eating that you see generally, and what role does the parent really play?
This is such a hard question. And again, I found my way to feeding because of worries and having feeding challenges that were really taking over a large part of my energy. And I just didn't know. I didn't know that what I was doing was backfiring. I didn't know that because of how I was feeding, I was making the problems worse and making my daughter less able to tune into hunger and satiety and to have trouble with her relationship with food. And so it's very humbling. I had some guilt, and we just do the best we can as parents. And hopefully we find resources and support, which is why we've written the books and we want to be out there. Unfortunately, so many parents, like you said, there's terrible judgment and there's really bad advice. And so we have so much empathy for parents who desperately love their kids, want to do their best, but they've been given terrible advice. Yeah. And a lot of it, from doctors, we've heard like, oh, don't worry, she'll survive even if she doesn't eat for 3 weeks. I can't even imagine, they may not die, but, and this was to a parent of a child with sensory issues who'd been really avoidant for years, or just make them eat. And, we know that for parents of children who've had feeding difficulties before the age of 2, 100% will have, out of desperation, kind of picked up some feeding things that aren't necessarily helpful and that can make things worse. And I've been there. And so really it's about support and education for parents to deal with potential challenges that come up, whether it's just that typical picky eating phase we talked about, where it's like, oh, she liked this yesterday and now she doesn't, so I'm going to do the 1-bite rule, or I'm going to make them eat it, or I'm going to try this or try that. So we see that children struggle with eating for lots of different reasons. And so why are we seeing picky or persistent or extreme picky eating? And one of them is it's just a typical phase, and we need to educate parents on how to navigate it so they come through at the other side without inadvertently making things worse. So another piece that almost never gets talked about is the child's temperament. And so we know that kids have different temperaments. So parents will say to me all the time, well, we use the no thank you bite rule. So we make all our kids eat 1 bite of each food, and it works. And I'm like, well, why are you here at my workshop then? And then they'll say, well, it works for 2 of our kids, but our 3rd child, it's like a 45-minute hostage negotiation, right? And then when you explore that, the 3rd child was maybe born a little bit early, right? So we have some different risk factors, premature, and maybe they're a little bit of a sensitive temperament. So they're very easily upset. They're very emotional. They're very tuned in to parents, when they show displeasure or disappointment, that emotionally they're really connected. And the temperament piece, we know that some kids are just naturally cautious, slow to warm up, in other words. And so we actually have research that shows that kids, and this was in toddlers, who like jump in and play with new toys, well, guess what? They're going to approach new foods the same way. Kids who hang back in an experimental setting and don't immediately engage with new toys, maybe they're more cautious, slow to warm up, they want to observe first, they're going to approach food the same way. So we start to see these different factors that predispose children to being more selective or cautious. And if parents aren't aware of this and they just get told by some pediatrician, I made my child just eat it, and if they didn't eat it, it showed up for the next meal until they did, and it worked for my kid. It's like, great, maybe you had one of these easygoing kids, or, for whatever reason that may have worked for you. But for some children, those same tactics are going to absolutely backfire and lead things to become much worse. So we have temperament, we have prematurity seems to be a risk factor, sensory challenges. So if you have a child, an autistic child, or where there are sensory processing challenges, adopted children or children in foster care, or kids who've experienced medical trauma, so kids who've had lots of dental surgeries or special needs, so maybe with oral motor skills, so children with Down syndrome, or there's a tongue tethering. Basically anything that makes getting food into your mouth, chewing it, swallowing it, digesting it, and getting it out the other end, anything that's hard about that process or difficult or painful or was painful in the past can set parents up for these feeding problems. And so, we say, we don't blame parents for feeding problems, but if we have these challenges and then terrified or scared or just run-of-the-mill worried parents aren't supported, and we see then feeding out of anxiety and these tactics of pressuring or, trying to get kids to eat, we see that those can often backfire. And we have a lot of data now that shows that coercing or pressuring kids to eat actually leads to them eating less well and less fruits and vegetables, and it impacts their weight gain as well. And again, that temperament piece is going to be that children will have a different threshold for what they feel is pressure. So one kid, the no thank you bite rule, they eat it, they're happy. Great. That's not pressure for them. But for the kid where it's that hostage negotiation, that's backfiring and it's going to undermine their eating skills. And so the good news is for a lot of families I work with, all that effort and worry and begging and pulling on that rope, we can let go of that and that kids will actually eat better. So in some ways it's less work and less conflict. So, the process can be really transformational.
Yeah, I think it's important to make that distinction that the parents aren't necessarily, it's not their fault, but the fact that they do play a role in it is, I think, empowering because that does give people hope that they can change it and improve the outcome. So really nice, nice distinction there. So with the book that you co-authored, Helping Your Child with Extreme Picky Eating, focuses a lot on a child's needs and fears around feeding. Do you have any other feeding-related fears that you see in children?
Yeah, it really depends on the child's experiences. Mm-hmm. And so, if we think about why a child might be afraid to eat, if they've had something that hurt or was scary. So one of my first clients was an infant where the pediatrician discharging from the hospital said, do whatever you have to get food into them. And, bless them, these terrified parents were told that the child was underweight, actually was growing very steadily, but at the 20th percentile. So there's this really important piece that I hope we'll touch on more, but this misperception around weight is the big trigger for this fear for parents. So this parent thought the child was underweight, even though they were just smaller than average. Told, do whatever you have to. And we all know that desperation in the middle of the night. And when you're not getting that X ounces, you have to get this amount in. So it turned out that unfortunately, dad was clamping the child's head down and force feeding, and the child was protecting her airway. So sputtering, coughing, kind of turning purple. And so that's super scary. So if children have had these experiences where, wow, I almost choked when I eat, or it hurts when I eat, or gosh, I can't feel this piece in my mouth, and so I'm gagging, or, I had this unfortunate experience where I vomited right after I ate at the table in the cafeteria at school. So these are called aversive experiences, and it just means that something bad happened when I was trying to eat. It didn't feel good. And so anytime somebody's had a bad experience with eating, they're going to try to avoid it. And so this kiddo in my example ended up at the feeding clinic where the one who'd been forced bottle fed really, and was diagnosed with an oral aversion that was felt to be sensory. And so then they're trying to sort of desensitize by putting a brush in there. And really what we can do sometimes is create an oral aversion when we have these negative experiences around eating. And so all we did with that infant was just like, best practice, here's how we feed and make eye contact and engage socially and listen to your baby's cues. So when they say they're done eating, you don't push beyond it. Mm-hmm. You want them to, and this goes true for all ages, infants, toddlers, preschoolers. We want kids to come to meals in a calm, regulated state. If you're crying or you're negotiating tearfully over how many bites, you can't tell if your body's hungry. You're not going to be curious about trying new foods. So we want kids to feel safe and comfortable and to bring that piece back to the table, because you're really hitting it that fear, whether it's the child's fear around the eating experience or what happened with food, or the parent's fear around they're not getting enough or they're not growing enough. That's actually step one in our book, is how do we get the anxiety? Early on in one of my slogans was, take anxiety off the menu.
I like that.
But we need to get anxiety off the table for the parents who are doing the feeding and for the children. But to do that, we have to listen to parents' concerns. Is there something to worry about? If so, let's address it. But if not, we need to reassure parents and help them with best practice feeding.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting when you say that, having an aversive experience, because it might in some cases have been an event that the parents don't even remember later on.
Mm-hmm.
It might have been something that made a real impact on the child, but parent didn't notice, or they weren't there, or they didn't realize what the child's experience was, and they just didn't make an impact somehow. So you mentioned in your book that there's a concept about, working on what to serve, but also how to serve it. How would you distinguish between those things? And what might that look like in practice?
Sure. Well, I think that so often, and I know I was guilty of this when I was practicing family medicine, and I'd see someone come in and maybe their weight was going up very quickly or going down. My immediate focus was, what are they eating and how much are they eating? And so we're so focused on, 3 more bites of, or we have to get this vegetable in, or we have to get, that in. And the focus is on the food, the nutrition, and we kind of forget about all that other important stuff about, well, what is the mealtime atmosphere like? What is it like for my child to sit at the table or the kitchen counter, if we're even sitting at the table or the kitchen counter? What emotional state are they at when they come to mealtimes? And so for me, how we feed children, how they feel at the table, and this includes, again, teenagers, how their embodied experience, right, is at the table is going to make a huge difference. And so I think that how and that whole emotional piece matters as much or more than what we put on the table, at least especially in the beginning, if we're transitioning from, meal times that feel like hostage negotiating, where, most of my clients, when I first start working, will say, well, 95% of what we're talking about is who's eating how much of what. And it's 2 more bites of this. We're like raising a great generation of lawyers to negotiate, or negotiators, because most of the parents will say, oh, he's a master negotiator. And so, if mealtimes are all about negotiating bites and trying to, at what cost are we getting that 1 bite of cucumber in? So we may have to bribe with a brownie to get it in. We may have 10 minutes of tears, a kid who's getting up from the table. And so if all we're focusing on is that 1 bite of vegetable, and we've been doing these tactics for 3 years and things aren't getting better, sometimes the place to start is not with what we're serving, but how we're serving it. And so, this is something we really explore a lot in the book is, okay, once your worry's been addressed, so we know their basic nutrition needs are being met, we know that they're growing and doing fine, which most of the kids I work with are, then how can we help parents to get out of that cycle? This worry cycle of, we've got the feeding challenge, we have worried parents, and I've been there again, we feed in ways that backfire. How do we get out of that cycle? And so there's a lot in the book about how are we pressuring children, because the pressure is what brings the conflict. And so helping parents to realize, and we go over the research a little bit and stories, and just asking parents to look at their own table. Yeah, you know what, this 2-bite rule, the bribing with dessert, the begging, the stickers, all of this stuff has not helped for a couple of years. And so it's really scary, though, for parents to kind of say, okay, we're going to take away these things we've been doing because we're recognizing they're not working. And we're going to transition to this trust model. Ellen Satter's work is the foundation of that. This trust model where we're taking the pressure away and we're going to kind of jump off this cliff and trust that with pleasant meal times, with routine, so they're not, nibbling in between meals and snacks, so they have the opportunity to develop hunger, with including a preferred food at every meal and snack opportunity, with a focus on being good company and not having the child feel like they're, bombarded with pressure the whole time, and with these specific strategies that we see kids being more comfortable at the table, not being upset, and being better able to tune in to hunger and fullness cues. So that's what I mean by the how, is really the emotional piece. And another quick tip is, we talk about offering a variety of foods. And so often when I do home visits, I've had parents say, well, I offer him X, Y, and Z, and he just says, no, no, no. And so offering a child or a young adolescent is not standing there saying, well, do you want cucumbers tonight? Do you want peas? Do you want apples? Because the default is going to be no, no, no.
Right.
And so the parent's responsibility is doing some of that menu planning, figuring that out, having that list written down. Here are the 15 foods she eats right now. Here's a list of foods she ate in the past and, family food. So we're going to sit down to dinner and here's the rotisserie chicken, mom picked up on the way home from work. The kiddo likes pretzels and frozen peas just right out of the bag. So we'll have a bowl of frozen peas, a bowl of pretzels. So there's accepted foods. Maybe the child's accepted condiment is ketchup or whatever. All of that's on the table. And then there are different foods. So we're not asking, we're just putting it out there so that we don't immediately get shut down and negotiating.
That's interesting. So it's a kind of a matter of making sure they have something there that they can or will accept, but not necessarily making that the meal for everyone to the exclusion of other foods.
Right.
Or
absolutely.
Another common thing I see, and I'd be curious to get your comments on this. I think most parents have probably done this at one time or another, preparing something for the parents to eat, right?
Yes.
But just kind of saying, oh, well, my kids don't like that. So they make like a separate meal for their kids. And so maybe you're having steak and, something else while the child is having chicken nuggets with frozen peas.
Absolutely.
And it's kind of two separate meals. So what are your thoughts on that? Is it sort of best to maybe put all those things together on the table and let them choose so that they're not feeling excluded from your meal or...
Yeah.
But you don't want to deny them, and only offer them steak. Is that?
Absolutely. So we want to honor our need as parents to nurture, right? We're not going to just, hopefully, although I've heard doctors and even nutritionists recommend this, we're not going to just say, well, just make steak and Brussels sprouts and he'll eat it when he gets hungry enough. No child will starve himself, right? There's actually some who will. It's not common, but some who will, who are really struggling. I also wanted to mention that all the advice I'm giving, I think is helpful for extreme picky eating, typical picky eating. The great thing is when you feed in this responsive feeding way or the division of responsibility, you can feed all the kids the same way, whether they're 2 or 10, biological, adopted, special needs, bigger bodies, smaller bodies, because what this is about is helping each child tune into their own body's hunger and fullness and natural growth patterns. We want to support that. So back to your question about how do we do meals together, right? And so many of the clients I've worked with where their kids eat 5 or 10 foods and they're anxious when new foods are on the table potentially. So often their kids will end up eating at the kitchen island from their 5 or 10 foods. And so they're not really even seeing the foods that they're going to hopefully learn to enjoy eating. And so family meals, it can feel really daunting. It doesn't have to be. We sort of set up in our mind that the family meal is the home cooked, spaghetti and the rolls out of the oven and there's salad. And a family meal is one loving, caring adult eating with a child, and ideally from the same foods. Now, it doesn't mean just steak and Brussels sprouts. It just means that in the middle of the table is everyone's food options, something that everyone can come to the table eating. So if you're eating McDonald's in the drive-thru and eating in the car on the way to, hockey or whatever, if you can take 10 minutes and go sit down and eat the food together, that's, it's a family meal. And convenience foods. So if the kids are eating dino nuggets, it's all a family meal. And I think parents feel a little bit like this isn't really food. We actually know that research is that when food is not cooked from scratch, parents don't tend to eat as much with their kids. So we want it, all food is, family food. So it all goes in the middle of the table. You're absolutely right. But there's no way the child will bridge to or learn to eat different foods if they're at the table by themselves and they're not exposed to it. So serving family style is the number one tip that families say helps decrease the anxiety. Because really, if you pre-plate for the child and you put dino nuggets plus half a Brussels sprout and, some steak on there, before the plate even hits the table, the child's going to be upset. They're going to negotiate. I don't like that. That's touching that. I told you I didn't want Brussels sprouts. So they're already now anxious. They're negotiating. They don't like the smell of the Brussels sprouts on their plate. So their appetite goes down. So if we just can pre-plate and have the empty food. And yes, they'll only take their dino nuggets and, their foods for a while. But we have to have that opportunity and have them have that sense of control and autonomy and not feeling pressured. And that can make a huge difference. So we don't see as often then the kid who's like, I'm not hungry, because the Brussels sprouts staring at them. Right. And then they leave the table and 20 minutes later they come back and I want my granola bar now as soon as the kitchen's clean. And this happens all the time. And parents are like, oh, he's so manipulative. He came back half an hour after the meal and now he says he's hungry. But really, when the kids are negotiating, upset, anxious, they cannot feel their hunger cues. So it's not being manipulative. It's that they're upset, then they leave the table and they do Minecraft or they read or they watch Curious George or whatever it is. And then their heart rate comes down, the stress hormones kind of clear out. And then they actually realize, oh yeah, I was kind of hungry. And so it's all of that kind of understanding and empathy building piece.
Yeah. And that kind of took the words right out of my mouth for the next question, which was, what do you do when your child doesn't eat at the table and then wants to eat something else right after? But it sounds like what you're saying is sit together, let them pick what they want off the table, keep the anxiety low, and then they may not ever even do that.
Yeah, that later often goes away very quickly when they know that they have foods they can fill up on. And the next important piece of that is when parents tell me they're not eating at mealtimes, is I actually have them write down for 3 days, what time are they eating? What are they eating? And then you find all these things where it's like, oh, they had a glass of milk or a sippy cup of milk half an hour before dinner. Well, that's super filling. Exactly.
Lots of snacks. I find it really common these days for people, and I did this a lot too, so I'm not excluding myself from this, but people bring snacks wherever they go. Like you go to the park and you take a snack with you, and you go to the store and you take a snack with you. And kids seem to be snacking all of the time. I don't really remember my mom or other moms, when I was growing up in that different generation, having food with us everywhere we went.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think there's an important distinction. So, we call them eating opportunities, because a couple of things is snacking. A lot of people think of it's just kind of eating little bits all day long, or they think, oh, a snack is snack food and dinner is dinner food. And so we always will hear, well, they'll eat great at snack, because snack is goldfish crackers or a cheese stick or, something from their accepted list. And then dinner is generally more challenging and we've put more effort into it. So we get more upset and there's more pressure and expectation. And so I still use the word snack, but I kind of think of, kids eating its mini meals or its eating opportunities, so that we don't fall into that snack trap. So I actually think snacks are a great thing. And when I went to the park, we would have snacks with us. But the difference is they're not wandering around for 3 hours with the baggie. It's like, we're going to be there for nap time was here, or right after school, I'm going to pick my kiddo up. And boy, their lunch was at 12. It's 3:30. We're going to get to the park and sit down and eat those 2% milk box. We're going to have the crackers and the clementines or whatever it is. We're going to sit down. We're going to have a snack till they're done. And then they're going to play. And then 2 or 3 hours later, we're going to have dinner. So that's very different than what we do see a lot of kids doing, which is, I used to go to those play dates too, and it was like this carbohydrate buffet for the whole 3 hours where the stuff was just in the middle of the table. And I had a kiddo who loved to eat and who would just eat the whole time. And so conversely, for kids who have a big appetite, so we've been talking a lot about kids who are smaller and maybe have small appetites, but there are picky and selective kids who live in bigger bodies and really like to eat and have a good appetite. They just don't eat as much variety. And so that's really frustrating too, is that sort of a lot of times with smaller appetite kids, there's this misinterpretation, or we think, parents often will think that a child's serving really is much bigger than what they need, or they have to eat this amount. So parents of smaller kids often have been told, even by a doctor, just let them eat whenever you can, or get them to eat, or follow them around with, crackers or sippy cup. It doesn't help kids who are either bigger or smaller with self-regulation when there's food constantly available. So the low appetite kids actually will eat less if they've got a couple of goldfish crackers in their belly. So they do better if they've just had that window of And it might be an hour and a half to 2 hours with smaller kids, depending on nap time, or it might be 3 to 4 hours for older kids. But they do better when they've had a period of time where their stomachs are empty. That's physiologically what works best to support hunger and fullness and kind of figuring out how our body works for the vast majority of kiddos.
Yeah. Now, what about the child who wants to snack many times throughout the day, not as a formal eating opportunity, but like you said, the kind of constant stream of carbohydrates or walking around with the bag or something. And maybe you're trying to transition your child away from that, but you're experiencing behavior challenges as a result of snack limiting. What advice might you have for that parent?
So the first thing I would do is really talk about what's the mealtime atmosphere like, because often kids who are unhappy or fighting or in that tug and pull dynamic at mealtimes will try to eat not at mealtimes. So the first thing I would do is rehab the table experience. So that's a safe place for them to be. But let's say that's the case. I would wonder, why are we eating because we're bored, or it's around, or the kiddo has, some kids have really like oral stimulation. Mm-hmm. So we might even say for a kid who maybe is on the spectrum or likes the chewing, we might get some jewelry, or little pencil nub chewy toys, or the things that can go around their neck so they can chew. I don't see it very often, but occasionally, kids they want that chewing or that stimulation. And so there are lots of different reasons, but if they're used to doing it all day and they're really strong-willed, we pick our battles, but we make sure that we start with that routine. So we get up, offer meal or food, and then we say we're going to eat again soon. And then in the beginning, you might, really plan some fun activities and just start to work on that frustration tolerance. So they're crying for snack and, I'm sorry, it's not snack time yet. We'll eat soon. And then in 10 minutes, go ahead and sit down, and then maybe we can spread it out. So we're getting them used to the idea, we'll eat again soon. I often see the pouches, for toddlers, preschoolers, even parents. I think part of why parents can sometimes get stuck on those pouches is they often have fruits and vegetables in them. Kids like them because they can wander around and eat them, and they're in control, which is really appealing. And so I think that's just that part of parenting where we do have to sometimes set limits. And if we do it in a calm way where we can help with regulation, make sure it's not an oral, motor, or sensory thing, and then just start setting the expectations and making sure that, the actual eating opportunities are pleasant and that we're able to connect at that time.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you. I could talk about this for so much longer. There's so much to discuss, but I think we've probably hit our time limit. Dr. Rowell, thank you so much for being here with us today. I know there are going to be a lot of thankful parents out there waiting to try your suggestions. So I really appreciate your time.
It was my pleasure. And, there are resources out there. And so as a parent and as, a fellow parent, getting educated and find something that feels right and where you can, mealtime shouldn't be hostage negotiations. It's an important time to connect, and we can feed our kids in a way that helps them feel good, self-regulate, and stay connected with us.
Great. That's very well said. Thank you. For our listeners, if you would like to know more about some of the issues discussed here today, please check out Dr. Rowell's book, Helping Your Child with Extreme Picky Eating. You can also log into your Torchlight account and do a content search under the resources tab of your navigation bar and select the sensory processing content category there. That is all for now. Thank you so much for spending a part of your day with us, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Torchlight's Exceptional Parenting Podcast. Find this and other episodes on iTunes, Spreaker, and Podcast Go. If you're interested in bringing Torchlight Child or any of Torchlight's other caregiving products to your workplace, please contact info@torchlight.care. That's info@torchlight.care.